spoke up loudly with his hands raised. Did you just say that you run an official Pokémon gym? Right here in this compound. Certified by the Pokémon League itself to hand out gym badges to winning challengers. Fuji nodded, somewhat amused at Ash's pretty apparent excitement and surprise. Yes, that is most definitely the case, young man. I run Lavender Town's very own Pokémon gym. The likes of which has become all but lost to time along with the rest of this part of town. Back in its heyday, during the golden years of Lavender Town, my gym bustled with challengers from all over. After everything happened though, my gym started fading more and more into the background. Now, I rarely ever get challengers and the people of this town have stopped seeing me as the gym leader. Instead, I'm now known mostly as the crazy old man that lives in the ruins of the old part of town. I keep up to date on my gym license though just in case I do happen to get challengers, he finished casually. Brock leaned forward in his chair. Why doesn't the book on official Pokémon League certified gyms of Kanto say anything about your gym then, Mr. Fuji? He asked curiously. To which Ash, Misty and Giselle all nodded in agreement too. Fuji shrugged sadly. I may keep this gym licensed but because I never get challengers anymore, the newly updated guidebooks on the gyms of Kanto that you mentioned Brock has simply stopped including my gym into the pages. Even the Shadows Hallow Pokémon gym gets more challengers than I do, or at least so I've heard. Ash leaned forward in his seat as well with a determined glint burning in his eyes and, upon seeing this, his friends knew what was coming next. Mr. Fuji, I am on a quest to collect all of the gym badges of Kanto before this coming year's Pokémon League Indigo Conference and in fact, my friends and I just came from Shadows Hallow where I challenged the gym leader there and earned its badge. The boy stood up then and looked into Fuji's eyes with untamed ferocity all but radiating off of him. I would be honored if you would allow me to battle you for this gym's badge. Pikachu looked resolute from Ash's shoulder as he nodded and called out in agreement, Pikachu. Fuji just stared at Ash and Pikachu intently, looking into their eyes as he sized them up. Something about the fire and passion in the boy's amber orbs set an old flame for battling alight in his spirit and after a moments of deep thought, Fuji smiled and nodded. Okay Ash, I will accept your challenge. Ash smiled widely and nodded in return as Brock, Misty and Giselle looked excited at the prospect of seeing Ash have another gym battle. The old man took a sip of his tea again before holding up an index finger. We will have to wait until my friend gets here though Ash. I told her that we would catch up today and she should be here at any moment. The young trainer in question appeared confused. Friend? He asked. Fuji nodded and gave a slight grin. Yes, she is a dear old friend of mine who is also rather learned, I suppose you could say in the arts of Pokémon battling herself. In fact, one would say she's a rather big celebrity here in Kanto for both her status, as well as prowess in battle. Once she gets here, I am sure she would love to meet a spirited young trainer like you and perhaps even concede to watch and referee our battle. That is of course, as long as you do not become intimidated by her presence, he said mysteriously with a sly grin and slight chuckle. Giselle blinked. Why would Ash be intimidated by? Suddenly, she was cut off by a knock at the door. Everyone turned their heads to face the door as Fuji smiled and got up. Ah, that must be her now. Ash and his friends watched in anticipation as Fuji went over and opened up the door. They heard him greet the new arrival in a friendly way, like how two people who knew other for years would do, before engaging in a few words of conversation that none of them could hear. Hard as they tried to listen, all they could hear out of the mystery person was that it was indeed a woman and an older woman by the tone of her voice. She had a firm but confident inflection to her voice and this only further piqued their curiosity as to who it could be. Eventually they managed to catch Fuji say something to her about meeting a couple of new friends of his and a fiery young trainer that had just challenged him to a gym battle. They heard the mystery woman say something back in a voice that sounded to be of both surprise and interest as Fuji finally let her in and guided her into the main room. When the older man stepped aside and revealed the woman standing behind him, the group of young people almost jaw-dropped to the floor as they gaped in surprise. All except for Ash, who looked to be feeling a mixture of both excitement and extreme curiosity as to what someone of her status was doing there in the same place as them and how Fuji could have possibly known her. Brock was the first one to stammer the newcomer's identity out of all of them. Why you're A. Agatha of the Elite Four. He exclaimed loudly while pointing with a trembling finger. The older woman, whom had a rather stern and sharp-looking face, faded blonde hair and was wearing a purple dress with a white apron over it and a white oval pendant of some kind attached to the chest, merely gave a slight smile and nodded. She had a brown cane with her and she leaned on it while replying to Brock's choppy greeting. "Yes, that's me, Sonny. Good to know. Word of my name still gets around every now and again," she said in a crisp, to the point, yet still friendly voice. Giselle looked like a remoraid with her eyes being as wide as they were. But you're a member of the Elite Four. What are you doing here?" Misty looked over at Ash for a second. "Can you believe that we're in the presence of an actual member of the Elite Four, Ash?" She gushed with pure excitement tinged into her voice. However, when Ash didn't reply, she looked at him again only to see that he was staring at Agatha intently. Almost as though his eyes were sizing and scaling her up. Like he was about to have a Pokémon battle with her and was trying to learn all he could from her just by watching every move she made. The redhead had never seen Ash look at someone in such a way and had to wonder what was going on in his head at that moment. Agatha answered Giselle's question at the same time then. "Well, young miss, I've known Fuji here for many a year. Met him back whenever Lavender Tower was still going strong. I had just lost a Pokémon to sickness at the time, and while I was here paying my respects to it at the tower, I ran into Fuji, who was already living here. He helped me get over my grief by being a good source of conversation, an ear to talk to and, dare I say it, a shoulder to cry on when I needed one. We've been friends ever since, and I try to get down here to visit him whenever I get the chance to slip away from my duties as a member of the Elite Four for a time." The sharp-looking woman then slightly narrowed her eyes as she searched out amongst the kids for the one that Fuji told her about that had a seemingly vigorous spirit and had challenged him to a gym match. By sizing the children up, something she had learned from years of battling opponents, she could tell that all of them seemed like they could be potentially talented trainers. Rather, it would be enough to defeat Fuji, though, she didn't know. Eventually, her eyes landed on Ash, and upon seeing the way he was gazing at her, with what appeared to be calculation and complete in-depth assessment, she knew it was him. Unlike his friends, Agatha could see that this boy was different to some degree. While she could definitely see respect in his eyes for her, she didn't see any kind of amazement, fan worship, or disbelief like she was so used to seeing. Especially from younger trainers such as him. Instead, she saw that he was simply observing her, studying her like a hunter would do before even thinking about going after its prey. She then saw that the young Pikachu on his shoulder was mimicking its trainer's behavior as it eyed her carefully, and, needless to say, it was an interesting and unusual sight for her to see. While she obviously didn't feel scared or intimidated by him, which was something she had just learned to manipulate and control over the years, Agatha still felt herself becoming impressed with the young man's apparent method of assessing and sizing up people such as herself upon first meetings. She then walked up to Ash and looked down at him. "So, are you the young trainer Fuji here told me about that's challenging him?" Agatha asked sharply but not unkindly. Ash merely nodded. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. My name is Ash Ketchum and these are my friends." He pointed to said friends in turn. "Brock, Misty, Giselle, and this," the boy gestured up to Pikachu on his shoulder, "is my very first Pokémon and good friend Pikachu." He looked back at Agatha then and slightly, not dramatically, bowed his head to her while saying respectfully, "It's an honor to meet you, Agatha." Agatha, for her part, caught on to a couple of things during that small introduction. The first was how Ash had introduced his Pikachu as his good friend and not just Pokémon. For many trainers, especially rookie ones, which she guessed he was by the looks of him, very rarely ever introduced their Pokémon as their friends as well. The next thing she noticed was how he refused to bow lowly to her like his other three friends did. He still showed her the proper respect that most people his elder, such as herself, should get, and was also polite, but he apparently didn't feel the need to lower himself to her just because of her famous reputation. Which was again, something many trainers would and had done to her, and quite frankly, she hated it. She preferred meeting people that had fire and spunk and didn't feel like they needed to bow to someone just because they held a higher standing in society. The Elite Four member just nodded to Ash's response and gave her reply. "It is pleasant to meet you as well, young man. I can tell by the glossy coat and vibrant red glow of the electric sacs on its cheeks that your Pikachu is very well taken care of and raised." "Yes, well raised, I would say indeed." She then gave him a stern look. "Now I hope you've trained hard and readied yourself, boy, because I can tell you that Fuji here is no pushover. If you don't give it your all then you won't win, she advised in a wise tone. Ash nodded respectfully to her. Yes ma'am. I always train with my Pokémon and we prepare as best as we can for every battle we go into. We'll give it our all, he stated with conviction as Pikachu nodded with an equal amount of determination in his eyes. Agatha gave another nod and then looked at Fuji. Well, I would probably be right in assuming you don't have a referee for this gym anymore Fuji, so I'll act as the standing judge if you'll have me, she offered. The older man merely smiled in response. That would be wonderful Agatha, thank you. Misty leaned over and whispered to Brock and Giselle, if Agatha is really going to be judging this match then I hope the nerves of her being here don't get to Ash. She voiced in concern. Giselle and Brock just nodded in equal concern but didn't say anything. Fuji clapped his hands and addressed them all then. Well, shall we move to the battlefield now everyone? Seeing no qualms with the planned course of action, Fuji led the group to the door on the far side end of the room and opened it, letting them step through first. After everyone had entered inside the almost totally dark room, the old man flipped a light switch and the room was suddenly lit up in a bright glow. Ash and his friends were finally able to see their surroundings and found that they had entered into a large, open storage-like area with white stone walls and floor and metal ceilings. Lights hung from the ceiling and the battlefield stretched out in front of them far and wide to the other end of the room some distance away. Fuji stepped out into the trainer's box closest to the entry door and Ash made his way down to the one at the end of the building once Agatha had asked for his last name. They both faced each other after that with serious expressions on their faces as Agatha came out to stand on the sidelines. She cleared her throat and then called loudly, "This will be a match between gym leader of Lavender Town, Fuji, and the challenger Ash Ketchum. Both trainers will use only 3 Pokémon and the side that loses all of their Pokémon first will be declared the winner. There are no time limits and only the challenger may substitute Pokémon. Are both sides ready?" Fuji and Ash simply nodded without saying anything. Agatha eyed the two of them for a second before commanding, "Both trainers now choose your first Pokémon please." Fuji pulled a Pokéball out from his belt, which was hidden underneath his slightly long shirt, and threw it out onto the battlefield. "Shuppet, I choose you." In a burst of stars and light, the cloak-like ghost-type Pokémon appeared on the field with a rotational twirl through the air. Fuji chuckled as he called over to Ash, "I forgot to mention earlier young man, my gym specializes in ghost-type Pokémon. Lavender Town is known for its rather haunted mystique and it wasn't a little-known secret that before Pokémon Tower was closed up, ghost Pokémon would frequently make the tower their home. I decided to honor our town's ghostly traditions and what we're most famously known for by making this gym specialize in just that same type of Pokémon." Ash didn't reply to the old man's explanation, instead he just eyed the Hoenn native ghost type and thought over his options to battle it with. Even though he hadn't visited a Pokémon Center yet, Bulbasaur and Pikachu had already been healed up by himself earlier that day in Shadow's Hallow before they left. It wasn't a treatment to the level 1 of a Nurse Joy could perform but it still did the job and because of this, he knew they could easily battle again after having received an almost full day's rest in their Pokeballs. Bar their evening training session of course. Even with all that in mind though, he wasn't planning on using any of those 3 anyway. He liked to rotate his Pokémon in and out with every battle, especially big ones, that he competed in so they could all receive hands-on battle experience to go with their intensive training schedules. Which he essentially did just to make them more well-rounded and that was why he was currently planning on using an entirely different 3 Pokémon lineup for the coming battle. On the sidelines, his friends were talking amongst themselves. "Do you really think Ash and his Pokémon are ready for this?" Giselle asked somewhat nervously. "He hasn't had a chance to get any of them checked out at a Pokémon Center for days. Since we left Tide Town as a matter of fact." Brock crossed his arms and looked thoughtful. "Yes, but Ash has been taking of them and healing them to the best of his abilities as much as he could since then. They may not have been as thorough and effective as what Nurse Joy could do but Ash has still done a pretty good job. Besides, I really don't think that he's going to use the same Pokémon he did against Walt. I just don't see it knowing him. Ash refuses to use the same Pokémon twice in a match after they win a battle unless there's no other choice. Because of that, I truthfully don't foresee him taking it even a step further by using all or even part of the same team that he did to beat Walt." Misty raised an eyebrow. Wasn't Fuji being a little dishonest when he didn't tell Ash that his gym specialized in ghost types until right as the match was about to begin? Again, Brock shrugged. All depends on how you look at it, I suppose. Fuji really wasn't doing anything wrong by not telling Ash sooner because he still did tell him before the battle started, which doesn't break any rules. The whole match was just kind of a last-minute thing anyway, so it'll be interesting to see how Ash handles it. He's never battled without having time to plan, prepare and assess for his gym matches beforehand, and now that very thing is happening to him. I think it will be a great test of just how good he is at being able to adapt on the spot and not freak out under pressure in an unexpected situation. Good trainers handle matches well when they plan for them, but great ones will do well either way. Back on the battlefield, Ash finally chose his first Pokémon. Pulling a ball from his belt, he tossed it up while yelling, "Squirtle, I need you." The small water type came bursting out from his ball in a flash of light and stood ready for battle with no flashy intro. "Squirtle," he grunted with a determined expression on his face. Agatha looked back and forth a few times before raising her hands and bringing them down. "Let the match begin." Fuji called out quickly to put the pressure on Ash as soon as possible. "Shuppet, use Nightshade." The puppet-like Pokémon shot its attack at Squirtle, which Ash was quick to yell out for his Pokémon to evade. The water type quickly jumped to the left and rolled to avoid the attack. Ash then commanded Squirtle while he was coming out of his roll, "Now Squirtle, use Water Gun." The turtle Pokémon opened his mouth and shot a powerful burst of water towards Shuppet, but Fuji just smirked and ordered his Pokémon to avoid it. Shuppet did so and seemed to blur into nothing as it got out of the way of the aquatic attack faster than anyone could follow. Wow, that was fast. Giselle blinked in surprise, Brock and Misty nodding along with her in agreement. Fuji then commanded Shuppet to use Confuse Ray continuously, which Ash knew would be trouble if it hit Squirtle. He called out as fast as he could, "Squirtle, withdraw into your shell quickly." The water Pokémon ducked into his shell just as the waves of confusion began crashing down upon it. Fuji, feeling his plan was working, grinned before calling out, "Now Shuppet, use Psybeam on Squirtle." The puppet Pokémon's eyes glowed before several waves of beam-like psychic energy flew at the withdrawn Squirtle. Ash took immediate action. "Squirtle, fire water towards the ground with a rocking motion inside of your shell and get out of the way." Squirtle lurched forward in his shell and fired a blast of water at the ground below it, which sent the shelled Pokémon hurtling up into the air just as the beam of psychic energy impacted with the ground where he just was. Squirtle spun in fast circles up in the air as Ash yelled out, "Now use Bubble Beam on Shuppet." Ash's Pokémon popped out of his shell and fired a salvo of bubbles at the ghost type, who was now floating down below it. Fuji commanded quickly, "Shuppet, use Nightshade to counter that." Shuppet did so immediately and both attacks met in the air before exploding and throwing up a smoke cloud. Squirtle landed on the ground in a ready position just as Shuppet came flying through the screen of smoke at him, its eyes glowing as another Confuse Ray was shot towards the water type. Squirtle waited until the last second and then hopped out of the way, narrowly avoiding the sensory scrambling move. He skidded a few feet away to the left, and at that moment, Ash saw two red glowing eyes behind his Pokémon in the smoke cloud. He tried to warn Squirtle, but it was too late as Fuji's Pokémon sent a powerful Nightshade at his Pokémon and struck him straight in the back, knocking Squirtle off of his feet and sending him skidding across the ground. The smoke cloud had cleared away by this point and Fuji let no reprieve be allowed as he ordered Shuppet, "Now use Curse." Ash instantly knew that the next move would be big trouble for Squirtle if it hit, and he looked to his Pokémon, only to see to his dismay that Squirtle was still reeling from the surprise attack he just took seconds before. Shuppet's whole body glowed green before it cried out loudly in pain as an electrical surge of energy-draining static zapped a large dose of critical energy from its body. Shuppet then looked up with plasmic sweat dripping down its forehead and glared at Squirtle before sending that same electrical charge of green energy at him. Ash stepped forward then with his eyes set into a serious and steely-looking expression. "Squirtle, listen to me," he called out calmly but also urgently. "You have to snap out of it and dodge that attack now or you're going to be in trouble. Please, do it now." The water type heard his trainer and turned around, but it was just a little too late. The green, foreboding-looking beam of lightning was on Squirtle sooner than he could move. It struck his small frame and lit the blue-skinned Pokémon up as it started sapping him of a large portion of his energy. Squirtle cried out in pain as he was struck by the electric-like charge and tried to move but he simply couldn't. The attack finally subsided after several moments of intense punishment and almost instantly Squirtle fell down to one knee, one eye closed as he panted and grunted in pain. Crap! Misty shouted. Squirtle really didn't need this right now. He was already having enough trouble evading that Shuppet's fast attacks. Brock and Giselle both nodded with sweat rolling down their foreheads in worry for Ash, but back on the field, Fuji was already on the move again. Showing that he was much more brutal of a battler than his kind disposition would clue at. Shuppet! He called out. Shake it off and use Nightshade. The now very exhausted Shuppet lifted itself further back into the air and charged up a beam of darkness in its eyes before firing it at Squirtle. Ash's Pokémon was still down from the last attack and couldn't even hope to move before he was hit yet again with the attack and sent rolling across the battlefield before landing in a heap with scuff marks on his shell. Fuji then commanded his struggling Pokémon, whom the curse attack had drained of over half of its health, to stay on Squirtle and use as many attacks as it could to take him down. Shuppet may have been tired but it listened as it took off after Squirtle. Ash had no opportunity to warn his Pokémon before. Yet again, he was being attacked by a barrage of attacks from the ghost type. Shuppet used attacks like Psybeam, Nightshade and even Shadow Ball on Squirtle. The battered water type tried to defend himself as much as he could but it was all for naught as he was just too stunned and weakened by the previous attacks he had sustained to do anything. Ash's friends watched on in dismay as Squirtle was ruthlessly assaulted by the many attacks from the tiring Shuppet, and all the while, Agatha kept a very close eye on the match. Or more specifically, on Ash. She kept watching his every move and facial expression throughout the battle, sizing him up and scrutinizing his battle style. The older woman had to admit that she was impressed so far with how well trained his Pokémon seemed to be and how well he handled them, but once Fuji had really started getting into the flow of battle and Shuppet hit Squirtle with Curse, she knew it was all but over. That very attack strategy Fuji put into play was a deadly combination she had seen her friend use many times before, and even experienced, veteran trainers had a hard time not losing their cool whenever Fuji started going off on one of his onslaughts. She fully expected to see Ash start panicking since he was still just a rookie trainer, but when she instead saw that he had one of the most composed, well-controlled and focused looks on his face that she had ever seen, it threw her off balance slightly. And that was extremely rare for such a seasoned professional as her. At first she thought that maybe he just didn't care about what happened to his Pokémon and only saw them as tools for battle, which would have enraged her should that have been the case, but when she heard him speak words of deep encouragement and belief to his Pokémon, and also the way she saw him almost become one and move with each strike Squirtle took, she knew that wasn't the case at all. It was right after Squirtle had been struck with another attack and was forced to the ground yet again did she hear Ash say something that really made her see the young trainer in a new light. He had called out to his Pokémon and said, "Squirtle, I need you to hear me, okay?" Exclamation mark. You are strong, and I do mean strong. You have so much heart, determination and skill in battle that it amazes even me, your own trainer, every time I see you fight. I know you're in pain and I know you're hurting right now, but I need you to believe me when I say that I know. I know you can do this. Think of all of our training, think of all that we do to become one in our minds, hearts and souls. I believe in you, my friend, and I know you can do this. Now stand back up and let's do this together. Let us fight together and let us win together. Those words he spoke, words of such conviction and passion, almost sent a chill down the older woman's spine. Those very words he spoke and the way he looked when he said them, that look in his eyes, the fire she saw in them, it reminded of her two people, two great trainers that she had known in her lifetime. One was her dear friend Samuel Oak when he was a much younger man in his prime and taking on the world as a Pokémon trainer himself. The other, to a much greater degree, was none other than Lance Blackthorn. Champion of the Kanto and Johto regions, as well as herself and the rest of the Elite Four's superior. Lance was the exact same way when he battled, and right now, she was seeing this rookie, greenhorn trainer inspire and encourage his Pokémon on in the exact same way as Lance did his own. It actually made her eyes widen somewhat as she was almost fooled into thinking that she was watching a much younger Lance himself battling it out against Fuji. Back on the battlefield, the words that Ash spoke to Squirtle caused a whole new fire to light within the Pokemon's spirit as he forced himself up off the ground with a loud grunt of effort and stood up tall while staring Shuppet down with pure grit and raw fury in his eyes. The next thing that happened shocked everyone greatly. A blue glow of energy that almost looked like the color of the deepest ocean blue water, rose up and surrounded Squirtle. The Pokemon's eyes glowed blue as well as he raised his head up and yelled loudly to the sky. Ash knew exactly what it was that had just happened to his Pokémon however and smiled. His friends and Fuji merely gaped in astonishment while Agatha had a much more measured and controlled expression on her own face. Though on the inside she herself was surprised. It took a real bond between a trainer and their Pokémon to bring out the ability she was now seeing and to witness it come out in Squirtle simply cemented for her the fact that the deep bond he and his trainer shared was obviously very strong indeed. Giselle was the one to voice what had just happened for everyone who was still too shocked too. Wow, that's the ability Torrent. When a water-type Pokémon with that ability is really in danger and low on energy, Torrent activates within them and gives a huge energy burst to their physical and special attacks. She explained with awe in her voice. Sure enough, that was exactly what had happened to Squirtle and Ash wasn't about to waste it. He quickly raised his hand and shouted, "Alright Squirtle, that's the way to do it, now let's not waste it. Use Water Pulse on Shuppet. Now." Squirtle opened his mouth as the blue glow around him grew brighter and a large ball of aqua formed in his mouth. Fuji knew that such an enhanced attack would be trouble as he shouted out to his Pokémon, Shuppet, counter that attack now with Nightshade. The tired ghost type fired off a much weaker version of the attack it had been using all battle just as Squirtle released Water Pulse. Both attacks met in midair but the torrent-enhanced blast of water was much too powerful for the weakened ghost-type attack and cut right through it. Fuji could only watch as the aquatic attack sailed straight towards his Pokémon and impacted with Shuppet in an all-consuming wall of brutally ferocious water. The attack shot Shuppet backward and slammed it into the ground where it caused a large crater to appear in the ground. Squirtle didn't appear to give any reprieve as at the very next second, the blue glowing energy around him became stronger and a wall of water rose up around the small Pokémon. It encased him inside of it and Squirtle seemed to instinctively know what to do next as he lowered himself down until his head was pointed forward. Ash also knew what had just happened and recognized the telltale signs of the attack that he knew Squirtle had just learned. Grinning, he called out with a wave of his hand, "Now Squirtle, put that new move to the test. Use Aqua Jet." Much to everyone else's surprise, Squirtle shot forward like a bullet as the water around him sent the water type rocketing across the battlefield. A large trail of water surging behind him as he did so. Shuppet was just starting to shakily recover from the water pulse it had taken head on and then looked up only to see the water-shrouded form of a speeding Squirtle come hurtling towards it in the air. The ghost Pokémon tried to move but was helpless to avoid the attack as Squirtle struck slammed into it the very next moment and sent Shuppet careening across the battlefield. Squirtle didn't stop there though and kept traveling forward using Aqua Jet. He turned in midair then and raced ahead of Shuppet, hitting the ghost type yet again with another hard tackle as the puppet-like Pokémon was sent careening in another direction with a loud cry of, "Shuppet." Ash's Pokémon then began a pattern of flying through the air with Aqua Jet, never missing a beat as he would meet Shuppet head-on at a new location every time and send it flying elsewhere with a fierce strike of brutal, aqua-infused power. Effectively turning the match into what looked almost like a game of pinball, with Shuppet being the ball. Eventually, after several moments of the same strategy, Shuppet was sent flying up into the air once more. Squirtle chased after him until he was directly overhead of his opponent. He then started falling down to meet Shuppet in midair but Ash had another plan. Smirking internally he called out, "Squirtle. Grab a hold of Shuppet when you meet it and then spin around on the way down so it's falling headfirst." Squirtle did just that and grabbed Shuppet when they met in the air. As they started falling back to the ground he then spun his opponent around until Shuppet was now upside down. Fuji had no idea what was coming next and he had no ability to order kind of counter to Ash's next command. "Squirtle, now use Water Pulse and shoot it directly into Shuppet." Squirtle opened his mouth and sent a large gush of water at the falling ghost type. The water torrent was shot directly into the small body of Shuppet and sped up the Pokémon's descent towards the ground exponentially. Fuji's Pokémon hit the hard concrete ground as a large explosion of water and dust kicked up into the air, drops of rain and cement raining down on the battlefield just seconds after the impact. Squirtle used Aqua Jet again to veer away from the ground so he wouldn't crash and landed near Ash, where he stopped and stood straight up in a ready position. The only thing keeping him from collapsing now being sheer willpower and the effects of torrent that was still influencing his body. Once the smoke cloud cleared on the other side of the battlefield moments later, Shuppet was revealed laying upon the ground face up and knocked out cold. Agatha blinked in surprise before raising her hand a few seconds later. Shuppet is unable to battle. Squirtle is the winner. Fuji himself looked slightly stunned as he returned his downed Pokémon to its ball but merely shook his head then and smiled. He looked across the field at Ash, who was now beside of Squirtle while checking him over. The water type had returned back to normal as torrent had finally receded and was currently looking pretty beaten and scuffed up. Ash smiled at his Pokémon, whom was panting but also looking at his trainer with a tired smile of his own, and then patted his shell. That was incredible, Squirtle, and you gave one hell of a fierce performance just now. Thank you, I'm very proud of you. Squirtle just gave his trainer a thumbs up. Squirtle. He nodded exhaustedly but in obvious enjoyment of his trainer's praise. Ash then returned his Pokémon to his Pokéball before standing back up and looking across the field at Fuji. The older Mad smiled and nodded. Very impressive, Ash, very impressive indeed. Now, he pulled out another Pokéball. Let's see how you fare with this one. He threw the Pokéball in his hand onto the field then and out of the ball came yet another Hoenn native ghost type, Duskull. Ash observed the new opponent he would have to face and immediately knew exactly who to use. He was ready to see just how adaptive a battler she was and how much his training with her had paid off over the past 2 days. The boy then pulled out the Pokéball he needed from his belt and smiled. Thanks, Mr. Fuji, now let's see how you deal with this. Without another word, he tossed the Pokéball up into the air and shouted, "Come on out, my beautiful Butterfree." In a burst of extravagant lights, Ash's newest Pokémon, the pink Butterfree, emerged from within her ball. She appeared in a flourish and did several intricate spins and turns in the air with her masterful flying abilities before turning in a circle and announcing loudly, "Free." Fuji and Agatha's reactions to the appearance of such an oddly colored Butterfree truly was comedic. Fuji merely gaped open-mouthed as he sputtered, "It's pink." Even Agatha looked surprised but she hid it much better. She mused in her mind. The only all-pink Pokémon I've ever heard of can be found only on Pincon Island in the Orange Islands. No trainers are permitted on the island, let alone allowed to capture any of them. I don't know him very well but something just tells me that this young Ash would never do such a thing as capture protected Pokémon against the law, so I do wonder how he managed to obtain such a rarity. She grinned to herself and shook her head in slight amusement. This young man is just full of surprises. She waited until Fuji recovered from his shock at seeing the rare Pokémon and then called out, "Both trainers ready for battle? If so, then begin." Fuji quickly shook himself from his stupor and commanded his Pokémon, Duskull, use Will-O-Wisp. The strange-looking ghost type glowed eerily for a few seconds before firing multiple little blue balls of self-guided fire at the female Butterfree. Ash raised an eyebrow. So he's starting this one with a status-affecting move, huh? He thought to himself. Well, I've not gotten to see how good she is at battling yet except in practice matches with the others, but those really don't count. I know she's fast, so let's see how this goes. He raised his hand and then called out, "Butterfree, use agility to dodge and then use gust to counter." What happened next shocked everyone, including Ash. Butterfree nodded with a stony expression on her face before she quite literally just phased out of existence. Fuji, Agatha, Ash, his friends, Pikachu and even Duskull went wide-eyed at the tremendous speed that the female Pokémon had just demonstrated. The wisps of fire that Duskull sent her way simply passed harmlessly through the location where she once was, and at the very next instant, Butterfree appeared at Duskull's side and sent a strong gust of wind at it. Being taken totally off guard by her unnatural speed, neither it nor Fuji could do anything to counter as the gust of wind struck the ghost type and sent it speeding across the battlefield before slamming into the ground. Ash blinked in shock as Butterfree hovered in the air with the same impassive expression on her face and in her eyes. "Wow," he stated dumbly. "You're fast, Butterfree." Fuji seemed amazed as his Pokémon rose back up off the ground slowly and then looked at the Butterfree before them. "All right, Duskull," he said wearily. "Watch out for that Butterfree's speed. Use Confuse Ray and follow it with Shadow Ball. His Pokémon complied without hesitation and its eyes glowed as it sent a ray of confusion-inducing light at Butterfree, followed instantly by the dark blob of Shadow Ball. Ash was quick to react to the incoming attack. Butterfree used Double Team combined with agility. He shouted. The pink female flickered as several copies of herself were created and then increased their speed with that of agility. Just before the waves of confusion could hit, all of the copy Butterfree surrounded the original in a circular dome-like formation and took the force of the attack, expelling it upon contact. Just before Shadow Ball could hit, Ash quickly yelled, "Now use Wing Attack, as quickly as you can." That statement would prove to be an even further testament to the pink Butterfree's speed as she came rocketing out of the dome of her clones, all of them vanishing as she flew towards the energy ball. Just as she almost came in contact with it, Butterfree twisted herself around and smacked the ball of darkness hard with one glowing, powerful wing, knocking it towards the ground where it exploded. The female then rushed towards Duskull with her dumbfounding speed. Fuji, impressed that she had managed to dodge both attacks and in such an inventive way by using Double Team as a dome shield of sorts, knew that he had to stop her before she reached his Pokémon. He took quick action. Duskull, use Rapid Fire Shadow Ball and don't stop until you knock that Butterfree out of the air. Duskull called out its name before building up a massive amount of energy that it then started shooting in several rapid bursts of Shadow Ball. Butterfree narrowed her eyes in focus and just picked up the speed as she swerved in and out of each ball of energy that tried to strike her. Fuji grew frustrated as he saw just how disabling Butterfree's completely unexpected super speed was to his Pokémon attacks, but just before he could order any further commands, the pink female had already made it through the barrage of Shadow Balls and was now directly in front of a very surprised Duskull. Her wings glowed a bright white color then before slamming themselves into the ghost type, knocking it out of the air and towards the ground once more. Before Fuji could even think of reacting, Butterfree was already below Duskull, looking up at it with fierce eyes. Ash saw the potential for an early finishing move and took it. Butterfree used Confusion followed by Whirlwind. The mate of his first Butterfree hovered in midair as her eyes glowed blue and Duskull's descent was stopped instantaneously. The small reprieve from falling that Duskull was allotted did not last long, however, because in that next instant, Butterfree started whipping her wings together at an extremely fast pace which formed a small twister in the air that only got bigger and bigger the more power she put behind her wing thrusts. As the twister was made more and more powerful, the frozen-in-place Duskull was thrown back up towards the ceiling where it was then caught up inside of the whirlwind of extremely fast-moving air. Even though ghost types were technically strong against psychic types and should have been able to break free from the constraints of confusion, which was a psychic attack itself, the immense speed of the twister it was caught in made it all but impossible for Duskull to focus on anything, let alone being able to break free from confusion. Ash then put the final phase of his plan into action. Butterfree come down to the ground and then use Wing Attack on the floor. While the female Butterfree started doing as her trainer commanded and rushed towards the ground, repeatedly smashing into the floor with her powerful wings, cracking and breaking apart large sections of it into chunks, everyone else was left to wonder what Ash's plan was. Fuji had his face screwed up in an intensely concentrated expression with sweat forming on his brow as he tried to think of some way to help get his Pokémon out of the position it was currently in. Agatha kept a close eye on both Ash and Butterfree, still critically observing every detail of their battling abilities, before looking at Fuji. She herself was at a loss as to what Ash was going to do now that they had Duskull in such a precarious situation and also wondered why he was having Butterfree bust up the floor. For someone like her to be at a loss as to why someone was doing what they were in a battle was a very rare occurrence to have happened, but if there was one thing she was starting to understand from watching Ash battle, it was that he was apparently quite privy to creating off-the-wall strategies at the drop of a hat. Which could be an extremely effective method of battling for the executor of said strategies and a nightmare for the opponent facing them. Fighting an opponent that was prone to unpredictability in battle was a hard thing to find but a true joy to observe when you did find one. Rather you were an observer or their opponent. Even if you were the one undergoing extreme frustration in a match with someone who was so all over the place in technique and strategy and could actually make it work into a winning battling style, it was still very hard not to respect such a thing. As the older woman looked at Fuji, she could not help but think inwardly, interesting indeed. I haven't seen Fuji getting put through the paces like this or be forced onto his toes in such a way in a very long time. I don't even think he himself remembers the last time he had such a battle. Looking at him though, I can tell that he's having a truly enjoyable time with this match. She then frowned slightly. And after everything that man has been through in his wretched life, I'm happy he can have a slight reprieve of the memories I know still haunt him. Agatha then looked towards Ash and Butterfree. The young trainer was standing with his arms crossed and had a look of concentration, determination and focus on his face as he watched his Pokémon continue to bash the floor apart into rubble with her wings. As she stared at the boy's face, her thoughts couldn't stop wandering again. In all my years as an Elite Four, I have seen few trainers, let alone ones that are as wet behind the ears as this boy still is, who could keep my interest and attention so completely enraptured in their battle. His style reminds me of those I've seen from true champions and prodigies over the years with battle prowess and skill in Pokémon raising that were nearly unprecedented in their times. Her eyes narrowed slightly in deep thought while her focus was locked intently onto Ash. His intelligence and contemplative ways of thinking reminds me of Sam greatly. His fire, intensity, determination and obvious deep bond he shares with his Pokémon, not to mention how he can motivate them the way he does, reminds me of Lance. Also, the way he remains calm, cool, collected and level-headed in battle but with an obvious penchant for being brutal when he needs to be in order to pull out a win for his Pokémon, reminds me so very much of the young Sinnoh champion. Cynthia Sharona. Agatha smiled to herself then as her eyes remained on Ash. Yes, in fact, he and Cynthia seem to be extremely similar in how they act in battle. Calm, cool, collected, calculating and I dare say it, cold when need be. Which is something impressive considering that Cynthia is so many years his senior in both life and battle experience, as well as in her time with Pokémon in general. Actually, all of the people this boy seems to remind me of in ways are many years his senior, and to see him already beginning to show the traits that make them all so feared and respected in the world of Pokémon battling, training and research respectively is unique to say the least. A thoughtful expression came across her wizened face at that moment. Ash Ketchum. Now that I see his face I must admit that the similarities between he and Richard Ketchum, a veteran trainer whom I have seen take on the Indigo and Johto League conferences many times before, is rather unsettling. Richard is talented to be sure with much heart but is prone to rash decisions, recklessness in battle and a tendency to choke on his nerves during competitions of a higher importance. If he and this boy weren't so completely different in the way they go about battling, then I would almost say that they were father and son. Though who knows? The apple falls far from the tree on some occasions and this could be one. Still, the times I've met and spoken with Richard, he has never mentioned anything about having any children. So most likely they are not as closely related as parent and child, but perhaps through a more distant relation with the same name. Yes, that is possible. I'll have to mention this interesting young man to him when next I see him. She turned her full attention back to the match again but let one last item of thought cross her mind. I will have to also remember to mention young Ash Ketchum in passing to Miss Sharona should I see her again in the near future. I can see many similarities between those two and I believe she would find him interesting. A mirror of her younger self even perhaps. Cynthia, from what I understand, was a prodigy trainer as a child and that was what allowed her to go on and become the youngest Pokémon League champion ever at the young age of 16. It could perhaps be possible that this boy is more adept at his craft than even she was at his age. I will have to keep an eye on his career as a Pokémon trainer if I can, and if he truly sticks it out and goes the distance, then maybe in a decade or so, he would be able to offer someone like Cynthia a challenge that I'm sure she thirsts for. Of course it would be many, many years before this young man, no matter how skilled he seems to be, could stand before someone like Miss Sharona and hope to win, but when he's older. I do wonder. She was suddenly broken from her reverie by Ash shouting out, "Now Butterfree, start whipping those loose pieces of floor rubble into the air and towards that twister Duskull is inside of with your gust attack." Butterfree stopped what she was doing with her wing attack and then the very next second started churning up a powerful gust that sucked up all of the loose, large pieces of floor rubble into its vortex before shooting them towards the twister that Duskull was still trapped in. The chunks of debris were absorbed into the whirlwind and started swirling around the inside of it violently, making the funnel appear as though it were peppered with large dots as they spun around. Confusion was the main expression on most everyone's faces for a short time until Ash's plan started to reveal its violent nature. With Duskull being trapped in the center of the cyclone and immobilized by Butterfree's confusion, the many pieces of floor rubble that Butterfree had sent into the twister made the ghost type their prime target to crash, smash and knock into. Being that the concrete floor rubble was of a rock-type element and since Duskull was unable to move due to the twister and confusion, the poor ghost Pokémon was helpless to do anything as the chunks of hard floor slammed into it and thrashed it around inside of the funnel of violent air. Fuji watched in equal awe and dismay as his Pokémon was beaten senseless by pieces of his very own gym. Duskull cried out in pain as it was continuously smacked with rubble and the old man knew there was nothing he could do. Ash had his hands tied for him tightly. After several minutes of this cycle repeating itself, Ash decided to end it. Butterfree stopped the twister and used wing attack. The female Butterfree shot off towards the twister and just as she started to get pulled into its range of suction, she quickly put an end to the attack. The uncontrollable wind ceased almost as soon as they began once she stopped feeding the proverbial fire with beats of her strong wings like she had been doing. As soon as the cyclone died down and everything calmed, all of the large chunks of rubble inside of it started falling to the ground like pure lead. Duskull was left suspended in the air by Butterfree's confusion that she still had going and looked to be very beaten and battered from the pummeling it had endured. Fuji tried to give a command to save his Pokémon but the female Butterfree that had proven to be too much for them made it to Duskull first. She stopped confusion just as she reached Duskull and right as it started to fall to the ground, she slammed into it with her wings and sent the ghost type plummeting towards the ground. Duskull traveled in a fast-paced descent that seemed never-ending until it impacted the floor below with a loud crashing sound and then went still. Agatha looked towards the Hoenn native Pokémon after all the dust settled and saw swirls in its eyes. Knowing it was over, she raised her hand. Duskull is unable to battle. Butterfree is the winner. Ash quickly called Butterfree down to him and then embraced her in joy as he started praising her incredible battle talent. Fuji on the other hand merely shook his head in amazement before returning Duskull. After that he pulled out his last Pokeball and held it in his hand while closing his eyes. After he finished praising Butterfree, whom was equally as ecstatic as him for winning the battle, Ash called her back to her Pokeball before looking at Fuji with a deeply focused and slightly cautious look in his eyes. This was the last battle of the match and he knew that Fuji's last Pokémon would most likely be his best. Eventually, Fuji opened up his eyes again and looked over at Ash. His face was serious as he said sharply, "Ash, you have given me a truly memorable battle that I will never forget and for that, I am grateful. However, you have no hope in defeating this last Pokémon of mine, not even with that quick Butterfree of yours. It is my oldest and strongest Pokémon of them all." He gave a small smirk before throwing the ball up into the air. "Come out my friend and battle with me," he shouted. Out of the Pokeball came a large, matured, battle-hardened and powerful-looking Haunter. The Pokémon didn't even have the customary grin on its face that was so famous for others of its species. This one simply looked serious and ready to battle. Ash instantly knew from looking at Haunter how tough the battle was going to be and without any hesitation, he picked his last Pokémon to use. Tossing the ball out of his hand, he yelled, "Let's show them what true fire and the heat of battle means, buddy." In a flash of light, Charmander appeared from the Pokeball into a battle stance on the field. Dead seriousness was on his face with his tail flame burning brightly and his whole body tensed for the fight ahead. He and Haunter stared each other down as they both growled and moaned fiercely, Haunter. Everyone could instantly see the sparks flare between the two Pokémon and knew that this last battle was going to be the most intense yet. Both Ash and Fuji prepared themselves, staring each other down without so much as blinking as Agatha brought her hands down. "Let the battle begin." Ash and Fuji both yelled at the same time, Charmander, Haunter. Flamethrower, Shadow Ball. Both Pokémon were fast as lightning as they charged up their attacks and fired them at each other simultaneously with loud cries of, Char, Han. The large-scale, powerful attacks collided in midair with each other, mixing together and fighting for dominance before exploding. Fuji ordered for Haunter to charge through the smoke and start using rapid-fire Shadow Ball while Ash commanded Charmander to do the same with Flamethrower. Both Pokémon charged at one another through the smoke cloud and started launching their respective attacks at the other. Shadow balls missed their mark and collided with the floor, walls and ceiling while the hot streams of fire would sear throughout the gym and scorch whatever it touched. Charmander would duck, weave and dodge around all of the attacks Haunter sent at him while Ghost-type phased in and out through the blasts of fire aimed for it. Ash called out. Charmander used Slash on the floor to break up pieces of it and throw them at Haunter. As Charmander started doing that, Fuji grinned before shouting, "That won't work a second time around, Ash." Haunter used Nightshade. The Ghost-type started firing dark beams of energy at the rocks Charmander would toss at it and blast right through them. The dark beams would then continue on towards Charmander and cause him to jump out of the way to avoid getting hit. Ash quickly realized they would have to abandon their current strategy as the fast, powerful and well-trained Haunter was breaking apart the rubble no sooner than Charmander could throw them and then counter-firing with Nightshade. The tables quickly turned as Charmander was forced to start dodging the attacks Haunter was now using, occasionally switching up and using Psybeam instead of Nightshade. Roll, flip, twist, turn and jump was the only methods of defense Charmander had against the powerful, well-honed attacks that came his way. It became a face-off of power, timing, speed and accuracy as the fire type started to defend himself with his own moves in order to counter like Ember and Flamethrower. It soon became a violent sequence of explosions and destruction as the more experienced Haunter but equally as vicious and determined Charmander continued going head-to-head. Every now and again one of their attacks would hit or lightly graze the other and leave small marks or scratches on their body but nothing too extreme. Ash then yelled out, "Charmander, use smokescreen." Charmander stopped jumping around for a split second and opened his mouth before releasing a plume of dark smoke from it that started to cover the battlefield. The fire type then started running through the smoke while using multiple flamethrowers in many directions in an attempt to hit Haunter. However, Fuji just laughed. "Sorry Ash, but that little ploy of yours will only benefit us." Haunter used the smoke as cover and then used Shadow Ball. The ghost type started phasing in and out through the smoke as it launched multiple shadow balls at Charmander. Unlike its opponent, Haunter could see through the smoke, so it provided more of a weapon for the ghost type than it did as an assistant to Charmander, who couldn't see anything in the haze. Ash's Pokémon was then forced to stop his attacks as the first wave of shadow balls came hurtling at him through the smoke. The cold-blooded fire lizard was forced to start dodging and evading Haunter's attacks again, only this time with much more difficulty than before due to the low accuracy provided by the smoke. Try as hard as he might, Charmander still found himself catching a few of the shadow balls to his back or sides and was forced to compose himself as the painful orbs of dark energy really started to punish and pummel his small body with each hit he took. Fuji just bided his time, ordering Haunter to continue using Shadow Ball, Nightshade and Psybeam through the smoke to try and hit the madly dodging Charmander. After several minutes of this though, he suddenly called out, "Haunter, use Confuse Ray now." Before Ash could say or do anything to stop the unavoidable, Haunter shot a powerful wave of confusion through the smoke towards the as of yet unaware Charmander. Just as the fire type turned around and finally sensed the looming attack, the red waves of spectral energy were already upon him. He instantly felt his brain go fuzzy then as his eyes went foggy and his body began acting completely out of his control. Charmander started to thrash around at that moment and use his attacks without command or reason, shooting flamethrowers off at the air and tearing at the ground with his claws. Fuji could immediately tell that the fire Pokémon must have been confused by the sporadic attacks being sent out at crazy angles and then ordered Haunter with no further hesitation, "Start using your attacks on Charmander and don't lighten up until it's over, Haunter." Haunter let a vicious grin form on its face from inside the smoke cloud before it honed in on the flailing Charmander and started using attack after attack on the poor Pokémon. Outside of the battle zone, Ash could hear the attacks colliding with Charmander as he cried out in pain. The boy just took a few breaths to calm himself and knew that he had to wait for the right moment to reveal itself to him so he could find a way to get Charmander out of the bad situation he was now in. His friends, on the other hand, were not so confident. "Charmander's getting killed out there," Misty cried fretfully as she tried to see through the smoke obscuring the battlefield. "If Ash doesn't do something, then he's done for." Brock had a bead of sweat forming on his brow as he looked into the smoke while biting at the inside of his right cheek. "The problem is, I don't see any way that Ash will be able to plot or pull some crazy plan out of his ass to save Charmander this time. That Haunter is just too strong and experienced." It was a mismatch and now it's too late to compensate for it. Giselle shook her head. No Brock, you're wrong. Both Misty and Brock looked at her in question then. Ash is smart and he wouldn't ever put his Pokémon in a position that they couldn't handle or would get hurt in. You guys don't train with Ash and his Pokémon, but I do, and I can tell you that Ash and Charmander are very much in sync. An intense gleam came into her eyes. When those two train together, they put everything they have into one another and trust each other. The only other Pokémon I think Ash has that with to such a degree is Pikachu. He has a deep bond with all of his Pokémon, but he and Charmander are just. Giselle shook her head and glanced towards Ash. I'm telling you guys that there is just something special there between them. Charmander is way more than just a normal Pokémon and they both know it. Charmander likes to push his limits and Ash encourages it. So please. She looked at them again with eyes that left no room for argument. Just have faith, you guys. Misty and Brock was only able to stare speechlessly at her but could find no fault in her words. Instead, they merely nodded and remained silent, feeling slightly ashamed of themselves for not having more faith in their friend. Back on the battlefield, Fuji made what he felt for certain was his finishing move. With a calm expression on his face, he commanded with a thrust of his right arm, Hunter now use Hypnosis followed by Dream Eater. The ghost-type Pokémon flew further into the smoke cloud and found the beaten and battered Charmander just now getting back up from a shadow ball that had knocked him down, the confusion finally beginning to wear off. Ash's Pokémon looked ahead of him then and suddenly saw two glowing red eyes staring back at him through the smoky haze. Charmander, even in his current weakened state, was afraid of no Pokémon and merely gave a resilient glare back at the eyes as he growled, still trying to stabilize himself on his feet. The next thing he saw, however, was two hypnotic, concentric rings of red light coming from the equally red eyes that hit him head on and caused him to feel extremely tired just seconds afterwards. He tried with every fiber of his being to fight the drowsy feeling, but it was for naught. Charmander finally lost the battle moments later and fell backward, falling into a deep sleep before he even hit the ground. The smoke finally started to lift just enough that everyone could now see through it, and as it cleared, Ash saw his Pokémon fall to the ground in a slumbering unconsciousness. The very next thing he saw was Hunter floating a mere few yards away from Charmander before sending a spectral image of itself at the sleeping Pokémon, his eyes glowing red as he did so. Fuji had his arms crossed and eyes closed, knowing the battle was over, and even Agatha had a similar expression in her guarded eyes. The spectral form entered into Charmander and lifted the Pokémon up as a bright red glow surrounded him. The glow became violent and malicious then as it started sapping large quantities of energy from Charmander and into Hunter itself, all while tormenting the Pokémon in his sleep. After several moments of this, the glow finally stopped and Charmander fell to the ground in an unmoving heap. Ash's face was unreadable and Agatha's thoughts were playing through her head once again. Well, the two of them fought valiantly, but Fuji and Hunter are one hell of a fierce team to beat. Hopefully he has more luck with that Squirtle or Butterfree. Just as she went to raise her hand to declare Charmander unable to battle, Ash suddenly spoke. He spoke right to his Pokémon with a voice that sounded as though they were the only two in the gym. His tone was soft but firm as he said loudly, Charmander. I know you can hear me, so please listen. You are special. You are so much more than you think you are. You are strong, you are powerful, you are all of the things that I know can and will make you one of the greatest Pokémon this world has ever seen. All the training we do, all the suffering we've done to get where we are now. Charmander, don't ever give in. You are something more, far more than anyone thinks is possible. His fists clenched. You are going to stand at the top one day and be what you have always dreamed of being. You are going to stand at the pinnacle above everyone else, and I'm going to be there with you. We're going to get there together, Charmander. We're going to fight with everything we are and with everything that makes us better. He was shouting at this point. You are what no other of your species can be, Charmander, so let's prove it. Show this world that you won't give in for anything. Suddenly, and at those very words, Charmander started to stir as his mouth moved slightly. His eyes twitched and his body jumped before the flame on his tail began glowing brightly. And by brightly, it means that it was burning blazing hot. Steam started to pour from his body as his body twitched again, violently. Then, to everyone's utter and complete shock, Charmander started to get up. His battered body that was covered with marks and scratches from the battle began burning as the fire from his tail erupted outward and surrounded him, shrouding the fire type's body in a furiously blazing, fierce-looking wall of fire. His hind claws dug into the gym floor and the claws on his forearms extended as he looked up. The look on Charmander's face could be simply described as one of pure, unbridled rage and ferocity. His eyes were smoldering with a red-orange glow and his face was set into a ferocious-looking snarl. The air around him began to heat up. Steam escaped from his body, the ground he stood on became red from the heat and as he opened his mouth and expelled a breath, steam came from it in his nostrils like an erupting volcano. His shoulders moved up and down with the heavy, shaking breaths he took that was caused by the fury coursing throughout his very being at the moment. Charmander then raised his head up to the air and let out a bone-chilling growl-like roar as fire erupted from his mouth that was much larger and much more powerful than what should have been possible for a Pokémon his size. He looked forward then at Haunter with bloodlust screaming in his now blazing orange-red eyes. Everyone observing the violent change in the Pokémon were taken completely aback. What's wrong with Charmander? Misty stammered in a frightened tone of voice. Everyone in the gym was starting to feel the rise in heat as Brock looked at Charmander with his squinty eyes, straining to stare at the bright glow surrounding the fire type that the heat was giving off. He put his arm up in front of him to help shield from the intense temperature increase as he responded, I think it's Blaze, an ability that certain fire types possess which is similar to Torrent for water Pokémon like Squirtle earlier. It activates under the same extreme physical and emotional circumstances as Torrent, but this seems different than what I've usually heard Blaze is like. This looks a lot more powerful and dangerous than the normal version of it. Meanwhile, both Agatha and Fuji seemed to be beyond shocked at the turn of events. Fuji could only stare in amazement while Agatha looked at the seemingly rejuvenated and furious fire type with just a small amount of surprise actually showing on her face. How? She questioned in her mind. All the times I've seen Haunter and Fuji use that combination, very few have ever managed to stay conscious after it. Let alone battle ready. Her eyes narrowed once more. The way that boy can motivate his Pokémon to go past limits even they themselves don't know they have is just astounding. He almost seemed to speak directly to his Pokémon's soul and Charmander responded in kind. Its determination to keep going for both itself and Ash even when it was down for the count is what activated Blaze, I'm sure of it. A somewhat perplexed expression came across her face then. Though I have never seen Blaze take hold of a Pokémon like this before. Could it have something to do with the obvious strong bond both Ash and Charmander share that unlocked something deep within it that surpasses that of even Blaze? Agatha shook her head and chuckled dryly to herself. Watch yourself, old girl, you're starting to sound like that old tree not oak. Any more thought for her was deemed impossible though for at the next instant, Charmander made his move. The enraged and brightly glowing fire type lunged forward in a burst of speed so fast that a trail of fire and cracked gym floor was left in his wake. He charged straight towards Haunter and Fuji that knew his Pokémon would be in trouble if he didn't find a way to put down the incensed fire type. He quickly called out, recovering from his shock at the sudden turn of events quite admirably. Haunter stopped that Charmander with a combination of Shadow Ball and Nightshade. Hurry! Haunter started rapidly executing his attacks towards Charmander at rapid speeds but the fire Pokémon was completely unperturbed by them. His mouth glowed with crackling flames before he opened up his maw and started whipping his head from side to side, streams of fire exploding forth, coming into contact and shredding through Haunter's own attacks like paper through a shredder. Charmander kept charging forward all the while, breathing heavily in rage as smoke poured out of his mouth and nose. Seeing that nothing was working, Fuji commanded, Haunter, create your biggest shadow ball and then fire it at Charmander while backing it up with Psybeam. Haunter drew on the energy it had stolen from Charmander earlier through Dream Eater and started building up a large shadow ball in its hands. Ash, seeing the ploy, called out, Charmander, shoot a smokescreen at Haunter now. Charmander reared his head back as he ran and then threw it forward again as he expelled black smoke from his mouth that streamed towards Haunter. The ghost type had just managed to create its greatest shadow ball and then released it, firing Psybeam behind the dark energy sphere to increase its speed as the plume of black smoke washed over it and took Haunter by surprise. Ash yelled, now flamethrower. Charmander opened his mouth and expelled a white-hot jet of flames straight through the smoke cloud which impacted with Haunter's shadow ball Psybeam combination. The force of the incredibly powerful flamethrower caused the ball of dark energy to be pushed back and then turned slightly before exploding. The blast was enough to all but blow the smoke away as the shock wave knocked Haunter back several feet. Fuji, starting to lose his measure of cool somewhat now, shouted, "Use hypnosis, Haunter." "Stop, Charmander." Haunter's eyes glowed red as multiple red rings of sleep-inducing energy came forth from said eyes and sped towards Charmander. Ash was quick to react though. "Charmander, jump into the air and spin yourself with flamethrower." The fire type narrowed his eyes at seeing one of the moves he had learned to so thoroughly detest and then jumped into the air, still heading straight for Haunter and also the rings of hypnosis as he started spinning in a fast circle. The tail flame behind him blazed wildly until it was burning furiously and had surrounded Charmander in a dome-like circle of fire. The sleep-inducing rings of energy missed their intended target and instead hit the wall of fire as they burst apart into nothing. The flames around Charmander grew larger until he became practically invisible within the protective cocoon of intense heat and only a moving wall of fire could be seen hurtling towards Haunter. Just as Fuji was about to take more action, the wall of flames suddenly parted as Charmander came shooting through them like a bullet. His mouth was wide open as he spewed forth a truly tremendous burst of fire that rocketed towards Haunter and came upon it within seconds. The ghost type had no time to react before the flames consumed its spectral body and sent it flying back across the field, crashing into the ground several yards away. Fuji grit his teeth at the incredible damage he knew his Pokémon had just sustained and then watched as Haunter slowly levitated back up into the air with scorch marks all over its ghostly body and one eye closed shut. Charmander continued charging forward without stop and Fuji knew the next few moves were going to be his last shot at preventing a total sweep defeat for he and his Pokémon. He quickly started commanding for Haunter to use Shadow Ball, Nightshade, Confuse Ray and Psybeam on Charmander. The now injured ghost Pokémon had only been able to nod in understanding before it began unleashing a huge barrage of attacks at the incoming fire type. By this point however, Charmander had tunnel vision and could only see Haunter and taking it down within his vision. Ash ordered him to use a rapid flamethrower while he ran to stop the attacks coming for him and he did just that, never once stopping as he sent a stream of widespread flames in every direction he sensed danger. Effectively cutting through and destroying every attack Haunter sent at him with frightening accuracy and overwhelming strength. Just as Charmander was a mere 10 yards away from Haunter, Fuji called out, "Haunter, use Shadow Punch." The ghost type's arm became cloaked in dark energy as he reared back and prepared to bash Charmander away when he finally got close enough. Ash, however, had other plans. He quickly shouted, "Full speed Charmander. Jump as soon as you get to Haunter." Charmander picked up his speed until he was practically blurring forward and then jumped into the air towards Haunter. Haunter also took off into the air as both Pokémon went on a collision course with each other. Ash yelled again, "Now use Ember." Just before Charmander made contact with Haunter, his tail flame blazed up skyward and spread out like a wildfire as he spun his appendage around, twisting his body in midair. Ghost type and fire type met with a room shaking crack. At that same moment, Haunter's Shadow Punch meeting Charmander's glowing hot tail like two swords made of raw energy and power. At the same time, Ember caused another wall of fire to spring up and surround the two clashing Pokémon within its burning hot center. Charmander and Haunter fought and struggled for dominance and both Ash and Fuji were about to issue more commands but Ash was quicker. "Blind Haunter with a burst of extra fire from your tail Charmander." The Kanto starter focused even more fire into his tail and then sent it blazing outward towards Haunter. The ghost type quickly became spooked and shut its eyes from the flames as it backed away slightly. This gave Ash all the time he needed to execute the next move that he felt would be the clencher. He raised his hand high into the air before yelling, "Charmander. Dragon Rage." Charmander's eyes radiated an even brighter red that quickly turned to silver as his stomach glowed in a similar color. His whole body essentially lighting up with a bright white, silver shroud of light. Fuji quickly called out in a panic, "Haunter, get away from it now." The ghost type couldn't even attempt to get away though. Not only was it surrounded on all sides by a dome of fire but its eyes were still shut from the slight burn they had sustained from Charmander's tail flame burst. That small hesitation was all Charmander needed to open his mouth and reveal a glowing, bluish, silver orb of energy charging within. With a thrust forward of his head and loud cry of, "Char!" He unleashed the powerful dragon-type attack directly at Haunter, who was mere feet away. The ball of light became a beam that quickly swallowed the ghost type up in its bright glow and then cut a swath straight across the gym, through the floor and towards the opposite wall. The whole room flashed brightly, blinding everyone, before the charge of draconic energy finally came into contact with the reinforced wall on the other side of the gym and exploded with an earth-shaking boom. The gym shook from the force of the explosion and the room was covered in smoke as everyone covered their eyes and mouth. Once it all began to settle many moments later and they all opened up their eyes again, a strange smell of what resembled sulfur was in the air and a slight haze covered the room. A faint orange-red glow could be seen near the middle of the gym, and when everyone looked to the source of the glow, they saw a panting, sweating and battle-worn Charmander hunched over with his body still faintly glowing. Blaze's effects had finally ended and he had calmed down, but the harsh results of the long, hard battle remained, and the evidence of the massive power he had used could be seen in the way his muscles twitched and convulsed. Even still though, Charmander was looking ahead with one eye closed and the other open, an expression of total focus and intent etched onto his face that showed he still wouldn't give in yet if Haunter wanted to keep battling. No matter how exhausted he was. Everyone then turned their attention towards where Dragon Rage had impacted with the far wall and saw a mid-sized crater dented into its surface with a trail of torn-up floor leading to it. What really caught everyone's attention though was the Pokémon in the center of the crater. Haunter was lying squished up into the wall covered in scorch marks with its eyes completely unfocused, showing that it was lost deeply into unconsciousness. Fuji, Giselle, Misty and Brock all gaped at the sight while Agatha only let the shock of the revelation show for a split second before hiding it away behind her unreadable facial expression of stone once again. Doing the job she had been temporarily assigned to, she walked out onto the field and raised her hand. Haunter is unable to battle, the victor is Charmander. Seeing as how the gym leader is now out of Pokémon to use in this 3-on-3 match, I hereby declare the winner to be Ash Ketchum. Giselle, Misty and Brock all snapped out of their stupor at Agatha's announcement before they started cheering and clapping loudly for Ash. The boy in question merely smiled and nodded his head in relief that it was finally over before walking out onto the field and kneeling down next to Charmander. He looked his tired Pokémon over and then placed a hand on the fire type's head as he smiled. Now what you just did, Charmander. That was the mark of a Pokémon who is going to become a true champion someday. You were beyond amazing and I am far more than proud of you, he said with a genuine smile.